sit down. Thank you.
Dear delegates, dragi delegati, dear guests, uvaženi gosti, dearest fellow debaters, najdraži debateri, good evening and welcome. Dobro večer i dobrodošli. This is the last official part of 14th European University Debating Championship. It was held in Belgrade 2012. What is really important to say is this is the biggest European University Debating Championship so far. We would like to say that we did our best with whatever we could to make it the best as well. We sincerely hope you enjoy this couple of days with us. It's very important to say, however, how did we come to host European University Debating Championship? Open communication exists for 15 years now, and several generations of enthusiasts worked really hard so we can come to this stage. So they even worked when we were forbidden in the university. They continued to struggle to spread the values and to spread the values of freedom of speech, freedom of thinking, and to uphold the critical thinking argumentation logic, most of all. They upholded the education which is today recognized by University of Belgrade, who is our partner and biggest supporter in this project. What is also very important to say is that through those 15 years, there were generations who had a very, very hard time to preserve open communication as a project. And I would sincerely like to thank them for giving us a chance and establishing a platform for us to grow and to host EUDC here. For its development, it is also very, very important to say that freedom of speech and quality of freedom of speech in Serbia and Balkans in general has progressed a lot. We believe that this is a significant step forward, and therefore I have no words to thank you that you're all here. Thank you all very much for coming to Belgrade and making Belgrade the center of Europe in terms of critical thinking, argumentation, and debate for these couple of days. Thanks. In order for you to realize what we did in Belgrade, I'm very proud to announce a short movie that is going to show the progression of freedom of speech and debate in Serbia. Enjoy. I'll say no more before I call the Rector of University of Belgrade and the head of the Conference of Universities in Serbia, our Rector, Mr. Branko Kovacevic, to say a few words how the university supported this, and you've seen how much it means to us. Thank you.
Hvala. Uvaženi gospodine ministre pravosuđa, uvažena savjetnice predsjednika Republike Srbije, uvaženi državni sekretare Ministarstva obrazovanja, nauke i razvoja, uvaženi pomoćniče ministra omladine i sporta, naravno uvaženi profesori i dragi studenti, dozvolite mi da vas ponovo u ime Univerziteta u Beogradu i Udruženja Univerziteta Srbije pozdravim.
Permit me to welcome you on behalf of Belgrade University and the Association of Universities of Serbia.
Da vam čestitam na dosadašnjim naporima koje ste uložili ovih dana u toplom Beogradu.
And I wish to congratulate you on your efforts made in these past days in Belgrade.
I naravno da čestitam finalistima i poželim uspeh u daljem takmičenju.
And of course, I wish to congratulate the finalists and wish them all the success in their hard work.
Ipak u akademskoj zajednici, kao i u sportu, važe pravila olimpizma.
Of course, in the academic association, as in sports, there are rules as elitism.
Zato je mnogo važnije učestvovati i sarađivati, nego takmičiti se, nego pobeđivati.
Therefore, it is much more important to compete and to take part and to make efforts than to win.
Dolazeći ovde, setio sam se jednog događaja od pre 4 godine.
Coming here, I remembered one event going back 4 years ago.
2008. godine slavili smo 2 veka visokog školstva u Srbiji i 2 veka univerziteta u Beogradu.
We had a celebration of 2 centuries of education, university education in Serbia and the University of Belgrade.
Sadašnji ministar pravosuđa bio je student pobednik u retorici i bio je glavni moderator te proslave.
And our Minister of Justice was the finalist, the student who won in debates.
Mladi ljudi su najvažniji deo svakoga društva i svake zemlje.
Young people are the most important part of the society of every country.
Vrlo brzo vi ćete postati lideri u svojim zemljama.
Very soon you will become leaders in your own countries.
Neki će otići u nauku, neki u obrazovanje, neki u privredu, neki u politiku.
Some of you will deal with science, some with education, some with politics, and some with economy.
I svi zajedno imat ćete jedan važan zadatak.
And all of you will have one very important task ahead of you.
Da stvorite bolji svet nego što je danas.
To make a better world than the one which exists today.
Ja sam u svom životu promenio 2 društvena sistema.
I have changed 2 social orders in my lifetime.
Jedan je bio komunistički i socijalistički,
One of them was the communist and socialist,
koji je propao zato što je bila mnogo velika regulacija države.
Which did not survive because there was a great control of the state.
Drugi je bio kapitalistički
The second one was a capitalistic one.
i liberalni kapitalizam je propao zato što nije bilo nikakve regulacije.
And liberal capitalism did not survive because there was no regulation.
Propao je zbog neodgovornosti i gramzivosti.
It did not survive due to greed and incompetence.
I na vama je da nađete balans, da nađete meru.
And we give you in your hands the freedom and the power to find a balance and to regulate this.
Da napravite kontinuitet ka tradicionalnom evropskom sistemu vrednosti.
And to make a continuity, taking into account the traditional European system of value.
Evropski sistem vrednosti zasniva se na etici,
The European system of value is based on ethics,
estetici,
aesthetics,
hrabrosti,
courage,
pravednosti,
righteousness,
plemenitosti
nobility, nobleness,
i odgovornosti.
and responsibility.
Ja sam siguran da ćete vi uspeti to da uradite i da
I'm sure that you will succeed in that.
želim vam puno uspeha naravno i u ličnom životu i u profesionalnom životu.
And I wish you much success in your personal lives and in your professional life.
I očekujem da vas ponovo vidim u Beogradu.
And I expect to see you again in Belgrade very soon.
Hvala vam što ste učestvovali.
Thank you for taking part.
We thank the director for this wonderful speech, and once again we thank the university for letting us and helping us to make this very important step in advancement of everything that you saw in the movie. Now, along with the university, we had to have a support of the state in terms of progressing and in terms of reaching more and more people and breaking that wall in which debate was placed some time ago. For that, we have the help of Ministry of Youth and Sport, and now to say a couple of words, why and how did that happen, from Mrs. Snežana Plašnja, Assistant of Minister of Youth and Sports of Republic of Serbia.
Poštovani rektore, poštovani predstavnici vlade, skupštine, uvaženi gosti i organizatori takmičenja, dragi mladi.
Distinguished director, distinguished ministers, and distinguished members of government, as well as all participant students in this debate.
Ogromno mi je zadovoljstvo da vas pozdravim ispred Ministarstva omladine i sporta i ministarke Alise Marić, koja nas vodi sada trenutno iz Londona, gde se našim predstavnicima na olimpijskim takmičenjima.
I have the extreme pleasure in welcoming you on behalf of the Ministry of Sports and Youth. I represent Mrs. Alisa Marić, who is the Minister of Sports and Youth, and is at this moment in London encouraging our Olympic team of sports.
Ovde u Beogradu nam je zadovoljstvo što podržavamo drugu vrstu takmičenja, to je takmičenje debati u nečemu što je izuzetno važno i što je u potpunosti u skladu sa principima koje naše ministarstvo podržava.
And I have extreme pleasure in supporting another kind of tournament, a tournament in debate, which is greatly supported by our ministry.
U predvečerje obeležavanja 12. avgusta, Međunarodnog dana mladih, imamo čast i zadovoljstvo da slušamo upravo mlade ljude kako argumentovano diskutuju, prenose svoje mišljenja, izuzimaju stavove, čak i ako nisu saglasni sa njima, tražeći snagu argumenta.
As on the 12th of August. We have extreme pleasure in supporting this group of young people who, with their argumentary attitudes, take part in debates and present their attitudes.
To je u potpunosti naravno u skladu sa onim što Ministarstvo radi podržavajući mlade, donoseći sa mladima strategiju za mlade i zakon o mladima i dajući im priliku da se njihov glas čuje.
This is all in accordance with the plans of our ministry because it supports the strategy of youth and the law of youth, and this is all in line with our policy of our ministry.
Svim takmičarima finala kome sada prisustujemo želim puno uspeha i naravno ne samo uspeh u takmičenju, nego jednu veliku želju, a to je da kada se vratite u vaše gradove, u vaše zemlje, ponesete najbolje, najlepše utiske o Srbiji, o Beogradu, o svima nama.
I wish all the finalists much success in their final work, and I also have a wish that when they return to their countries, they carry along with them nice memories of our country and pass them to their colleagues and friends.
I na kraju unapred čestitam praznik mladih, 12. avgust, koji se dešava u nedelju.
And once again, I wish to congratulate you the festivity of the youth, the 12th of August, which falls several days ahead of us.
Thank you.
We were told, and as we know, that one of the things that is essential for having a democratic society is to have a free society which can speak, which can discuss, and which can debate. Society which has a platform in which it can discuss and talk about the most important problems which are not solved yet. In order to make that sort of platform in Belgrade, we had a help from Balkan Trust of Democracy, and with great honor I would like to call upon the stage Mrs. Biljana Dakić-Đorđević, who is the program coordinator of Balkan Trust for Democracy.
Dobro večer svima. Good evening, everyone. I would like to turn to English in order maybe to improve our direct communication, and I hope you will not mind. Distinguished Rector of Belgrade University, distinguished members of the government, representatives of the Assembly, dear guests, dear students and participants. On behalf of the Balkan Trust for Democracy, I would like to congratulate you on the successful participation in the European University's Debating Championship. BTD very much appreciates the opportunity to have been able to support this exciting event, which brought together so many young students and debaters. Our special thanks goes to the organizers, the Open Communication, that has so successfully hosted this prestigious event, and I believe that your reaction to the previously shown video shows the support. We appreciate their relentless effort to build and to strengthen the culture of dialogue in Serbia, and their vision and their work to organize this EUDC 2012 also highlighted Belgrade as a very relevant university center and a debating hub in Europe today. BTD is a project of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and in the spirit of furthering transatlantic cooperation, which has been the GMF's mission for the last 40 years, we have been working for over a decade in 10 countries across South and Eastern Europe to support dialogue initiatives to increase citizens' participation, to work in strengthening transparency of institutions, to initiate different partnerships among different sectors, and of course to foster the reconciliation process. BTD views this program as an important one, and one which is very much linked to our work throughout the region, that has so many times in the past supported young people's leadership development and their active citizenship opportunities. We particularly recognize the importance of the constructive communication that develops critical thinking, is based on objective argumentation, and is able to build cross-cultural dialogue opportunities. We are very much in the need of dialogue today within Europe and between different parts of Europe that Serbia is. Between old and new Europe, between the North and the South, between EU members and their neighbors, including the one in the Balkans. Unfortunately, our region has been burdened with numerous misunderstandings and miscommunication, and the fact that we share similar languages didn't seem to help very much. Therefore, we believe that we need to sustain the efforts of building the culture of public dialogue throughout the region and to engage emerging leaders in doing so. In this way, we believe that we all together, as institutions and other actors alike, are investing in committed and active citizens who will set different standards of political culture and public dialogue than is the case now. These leaders come from different universities, they come from high schools, and we should support them all. We once again would like to congratulate the finalists of the European Championship, and to all others to wish better chance at the next European Universities Debating Championship next year. I would like to wish you to enjoy this evening as well as the rest of your stay in Belgrade, and I would like to thank you once again.
Certainly very important, and certainly we are very grateful that she's here. The last speaker, before we announce a couple more things. The last speaker, but certainly not the least, is the direct advisor of the President of the Republic of Serbia, and I have a great honor to represent you, Mrs. Jasminka Mitrović-Marić.
Dobroveče, najpre, dragi prijatelji koji ste od Beograda večeras učinili evropsku prestonicu reči.
Good evening, dear friends. First of all, I wish to thank you for making Belgrade the world, the capital of the world, by taking part in this tournament.
Pozdravljam vas u ime predsjednika Republike Srbije, gospodina Tomislava Nikolića, koji vam svima šalje lepe pozdrave, lepe želje, jako srce i mnogo reči kojima ćete se jedni drugima suprotstavljati danas na završnoj debati.
I wish to convey you the warm congratulations and the regards of our President, Mr. Nikolić, who wishes you all the best in your debates, who wishes you to say warm and truthful words, and wishes you to have very good results.
Tamo gde je govorništvo započelo sa Ciceronom i Demostenom, slovi jedna poslovica koja kaže: govori da te vidim.
There is a saying which says, speak so that I can see.
A kažu da slika vredi 1000 reči.
And there is a saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words.
I zato ja večeras neću birati reči, jer ovo čime su moje oči večeras ispunjene je slika koju želim da Beograd uvek šalje svetu.
And therefore, I shall not select words this evening, because what I see in front of me is a picture which I wish to be conveyed to the world.
Beograd možda nije najbogatiji grad u Evropi i svetu. Beograd nije ni najveći grad u Evropi i svetu. Ali je Beograd najsrećniji grad Evrope i sveta. Jer iz nekog razloga vi, studenti Evrope i sveta, izabrali ste Beograd za neku svoju nezvaničnu prestonicu.
Belgrade, perhaps, is not the largest city in the world. It is not perhaps the most beautiful city in the world. And maybe it is not the best city in the world. But it is important for one reason, that you students have selected Belgrade to be the representation of what you are doing today.
2008. Beograd je bio grad u kome su se okupili rektori čitavog sveta. 2009. Beograd je bio domaćin univerzijade. 2012. je vaš domaćin. I nekako mi se čini da smo možda pogrešili, shvatite to kao šalu, a kažu u šali je pola istine, što smo univerzitetsko selo pretvorili u naselje. Trebalo je da ga sačuvamo i da od njega napravimo studentsko selo, da možete u svako doba godine da dođete u Beograd.
To go back to some dates, in 2008, Belgrade was the place where the letters of the world gathered. In 2009, it was the place where the Universiad took place. And in this year, 2012, Belgrade is your place. Well, maybe I had something to regret regarding one part of Belgrade. Maybe the university village should not have turned into a settlement with apartments. Maybe it should have stayed as a village where new students can come and gather every time you visit.
I na kraju, želela bih da upamtite Beograd kao grad koji govori jedan neobičan jezik. Reči su velike i moćne. Reči su jake. Naš pesnik ume da kaže ubi me prejaka reč. Ali ono što znam, to je da se sada u Londonu, u državi koja je prestonica moderne debate, vijori olimpijska zastava. Kada je budu skinuli sa jarbola, predaće je gradu koji će organizovati narednu olimpijadu. Naša zastava je zastava od reči. Onaj koji je ne vidi, onda ne vidi dobro. Na toj zastavi neka budu uvek ispisane reči ljubavi, mira, tolerancije, prijateljstva, zajedništva, druženja. I sa tom porukom našu zastavu od reči večeras, na kraju ćemo iz Beograda predati Manchesteru da organizuje 15. evropsko prvenstvo u debati. Neka im bude srećno i uspešno onoliko koliko je bilo u Beogradu. Živeli!
Nowadays, the Olympic game, the flag is in Belgrade also. Because Belgrade is now the University of the World, and the flag is therefore held very high. And I wish you to do all this so that in the next 50 tournament will take with pride the flag which stood in the
back to the boring me. I won't be long, no worries. So, you have seen through the video, the establishment or the platform or the background of what we have done, or through what generations who established the open communication as an organization have passed. I believe that it's extremely important to say that for whatever we did, we established some sort of, established or very specific club of debaters, which means that most of our time, especially during our projects, we were spending with the other debaters in order to fulfill them. I would like to use this moment to thank all of those who understood that, to all of our families and friends, because without their support we wouldn't be able to be here. Thank you very much. And lastly, since we're going to wait for the more appropriate moment to say hello to the oracle, I would like to thank someone who had an idea and he was willing to share the belief that we could pull this off. In London in 2010, in a bar, I was talking to one person and he said, sure, I'm in, but let's talk about this a little bit more. That person here now is our chief adjudicator and great friend. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Mr. Outward.
Hello. Before I announce the draw panel and motion for the open final for this year, I'd just like to pass on behalf of the adjudication team and myself specifically, thanks and appreciation to Milan, to the ORCOM, to the sponsors, to the support they've received from the institutions of government and beyond for making this tournament something which was possible and something which I'm happy to say is the most enjoyable tournament I've ever been involved in. I think we can all see from the incredibly moving video that we saw just exactly what debate in this region can do, and in any region can do. I was very moved by it, I think lots of us were. I think it's important to remember that as much as this is a game, it matters, and it really matters here. So I'd like to thank the ORCOM again for bringing us that video and sharing it with us, and I really appreciate it. I hope you all enjoyed it as well. So, the draw for this year's Open Break final in opening government will be Oxford A. In opening opposition will be UCD L&H A. In closing government will be BPP A. And in closing opposition, therefore, will be Cambridge A. The adjudication panel for this year's final will be chaired by myself, and with me will be Filip Dobranic, Mrs. Lisa Fisher, Mr. Omer Nevo, Ms. Anat Shapira, Mrs. Anat Shapira, Mrs. Stephen Nolan, the forever wandering Mr. Colin Etnar, Mr. Fred Cowell, and Ms. Catherine Murphy. The teams were given the motion as before, prior to my speech to you. By my count, they have had 12 minutes and 30 seconds of preparation time, so they will be coming in shortly, but there will be a couple of minutes lag between when I finish talking and when they start. The motion for this year's European University Debating Championships Open Break Grand Final is: this House would amend the United States Constitution to prohibit any involvement by religious organizations in the electoral process. This House would amend the United States Constitution to prohibit any involvement by religious organizations in the electoral process. I hope we all have a great final to enjoy. I thank you all for your time, and even though they can't hear me, the best of luck to all the teams.
Tom, I'm going to give you a hug. 2 at 7, 3 at 7:15, and many after that. If there are no questions, we'll put it to the floor. I'd like to call on the Prime Minister from Ostergate to indicate his time with his name.
Ladies and gentlemen, we on proposition do not believe that any nation under God can be considered a free nation, nor could it be considered a fair nation. We are very happy to present the motion that stands in our name. What do we think should happen? Firstly, we think all influence of anything that can potentially be attributed to be a religious organisation must be aggressively expunged from the US, from the political ecosystem of the United States. What does that entail? Firstly, we think in terms of defining religious organisations, they are either organisations that are explicitly tied to a religious community, or they are pseudo-religious organisations that purport to be religious or tie themselves to religious claims. We are happy to apply this to both of them. In terms of what we want to limit, we don't want them providing campaign contributions, we don't want them explicitly endorsing candidates, we don't want them lobbying members of parliament or members of government or prospective members of government in any way, shape or form. We are very aggressive in this motion. I'm going to bring you 3 points. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the aspect of compulsion implicit in their involvement in the US political system at the moment and why we believe it is pernicious. Secondly, I'm going to show you that this also corrupts the religious organisations within the US to their detriment. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about otherisation and explain to you that this is also a means by which the privileged are not only encouraged to entrench their position of privilege, but to do so under the auspices of being moral, and why we don't think that is legitimate. First point, why do we think that this provides some kind of compulsion, particularly when we know that religious organisations do tell the members of their congregation to take positions on moral issues? Why is it so different when religious organisations take positions on candidates? Well, Mr. Speaker, because we think this is an entirely different issue. We think positions on particular moral issues are ultimately questions of intuition and faith, and can be universalised within members of a particular religious organisation. However, when we're talking about a political system, particularly the US political system, we're talking about the appointment of candidates. That means several things. Firstly, it's not about taking positions on issues, but recognising which candidates will best reflect your ability, the ability to meet those issues. But secondly, it's not about taking one particular position on one moral issue, but about weighting a basket of moral issues against each other. And we don't think the same kind of universalisability can ever... Firstly, on the first point, we don't think this is not weighting candidates is not a moral decision, and therefore religious organisations are not well placed to make that decision. And on the second point, we don't think weighting lots of baskets of moral issues and their importance is something that can be universalised, because it depends on the particular situation of that congregation member. But why do religious organisations create a compulsion within their group? Several reasons, okay? Firstly, because there is that implicit message that if you don't buy this, if you don't agree with what we say, you are immoral. We're not saying that everyone who disagrees with what the religious organisation says will believe they are going to hell, but the point of moral compulsion is that it is not something that can be refuted analytically or logically, and we don't think that is legitimate in a fair democracy. Moreover, we think there are framing effects that take place when a message is sent explicitly by a religious organisation. People are more likely to believe that the issues being discussed are issues of moral intuition and faith, and that they should simply believe them. That is not the case when we are talking about weighing up what candidate is best for you. Secondly, there is simply the assumption that the message these religious organisations are making is good. Go.
What is Reverend Rush Limbaugh disagrees with someone, he gets called a whore on national radio, not for reasons argued. The religious organizations can't do something similar.
For the reasons I just said, Rush Limbaugh is, as far as I know, not widely recognized as a representative of God. Okay, secondly, how does this impact on religious organizations? Firstly, it creates an incentive for people within the political system to politicize those religious organizations. Firstly, by direct lobbying and the provision of funds and the provision of cutbacks. And secondly, it means that there are incentives for the more political members of a religious organization to rise to power because they can form relationships with the political group. We think that is bad for the political system because it creates corruption by the religious elite, but it also creates corruption of the religious elite by the political elite. And we think that's bad for religions as well, because it means they're more likely to spend time taking positions on political issues as opposed to actually doing good works and, taking moral positions on the part of their people. Thirdly, in terms of otherization, several points on this. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, the US is not one nation under one God, but one nation under several gods. There are many different religions, but more importantly, we point you to the fact that there is a massive correlation between being the dominant socioeconomic group in the US, i.e. white rich people, and being Christian. We think that is incredibly pernicious because it means that when you authorize this, the lion's share of funding that will go towards campaigns, the lion's share of lobbying and those kinds of connections will just be from Christian organizations. So several things. Firstly, that explicitly promotes the narrative that it is the white persons, that the US is the country of white people because it is white people and the religious organizations that represent them that dominate the bulk of airtime. Secondly, though, we do think dollars buy power. Firstly, in the extent to which they buy airtime, and secondly, in the extent to which they buy things like cutbacks, earmarks from people in power, and even just time with members of government that have power. It buys you their ear, and that is in itself influence. So we think when you allow this kind of system, it means it is more likely that the people who support the dominant religion are going to have more political sway. We think that is bad in and of itself because it entrenches privilege, but moreover, it creates an encouragement to the people who are part of that privileged unit to give money to their religious organizations. Not to give money because it meets their own self-interested purposes, which we'll say it ultimately does, but to give money because they are contributing towards a moral end. We think that is morally bankrupt. Ultimately, religious organizations, despite attributing themselves as moral, do end up representing the interests and the interests of the people that represent them. It is just true that the one thing Western philosophy has taught us is that most moral intuitions align very well with what liberal elites in Western universities believe. We therefore think this creates a narrative in which it is moral to entrench your own position, your own privilege. We think that in itself is also pernicious. For all of these reasons, we're happy to propose.
Thank you, Mr. very much for his comments. And then we cross as leader of the opposition to be in case for opening opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, Tom stands up and tells you that America is not a nation under one God, but many. And then he tells us that no one who believes in any of those gods should ever be able to make that as part of a decisive part of their political opinion, or should they be able to contribute to what actually forms political discourse through funding a religious organisation and allowing that to participate in politics. That's incredibly problematic, because the only thing he tells you is that that doesn't align personally with the best interests of individuals who donate through churches to campaigns. Why not? At the point at which you think that the part of your political self that is most important to you is your religious self, of course you should be able to go and seek counsel from the individuals, seek counsel from the church on what that means, which candidate is best for you, and allow the most effective version of that faith system to actually go and make a difference in politics. We don't believe it's good enough to exclude them. So one, why you shouldn't just target religions in this manner. Second, why the fallout of states allowing religion to exist means you would recognise that you don't have to divorce your political and religious self. And then why issues are essentially religious sometimes, and you should allow minority groups especially to contribute to this discourse. Before I do, he tells you that you can ask politicians moral questions that might very closely align to religious questions, but you can never ask which candidate represents that best, which candidate represents the type of thing I want to vote for, the type of me, the part of me that I want to prioritise. That doesn't change things. It doesn't change the rhetoric that they say damage the system. You can still allow people to figure it out by themselves, but you actually go away from them getting the best type of counsel, the counsel that is most meaningful to them. We don't think it's good enough. Then they say that a lot of rich white people are Christian, and that probably makes the rest of the society makes them feel left out. I mean, that's not true, because there are a lot of religious people who aren't the wealthy elite. It's simply the case that many people subscribe to faith and not exclusively white rich people, much as that would have been persuasive to a lot of lefties in the room. The thing is that maybe white people feel left out when they are poor within the system is because they feel there is no money speaking for them. There is no larger group that can actually get involved in politics with them. So if it's true there are some wealthy individuals who also believe in your religious opinions, they can become involved in the discourse for you, as opposed to leaving those individuals to still make private donations to the same parties, but to not allow yourself to align with them. We don't think it's good enough. And why it's not good enough to target religions in this way? Well, constitutions govern what it is acceptable in your state, what are issues for political discourse in your state, and what it is you should be allowed to vote based on. When you exclude this, you say that it is a more pernicious influence than any other type of belief or principle that you might have. They tell you that's because it's irrefutable. Yes, that's based on a principle that you might not be able to explain why that is the best for you. That is also the case if you blindly believe in capitalism or socialism. Those things might just be intuitions. You might not be able to question them because you believe they're right. We don't think that it is different in this case. Why is that? Because not everyone is a religious extremist who will never question their church. There are many moderate people who do make a decision when talking to their communities, when talking to their churches and engaging with their representatives, whether or not they want their religious selves to be the type of self that wins out in the political process, whether or not that's the way they will be influenced. But in cases where they choose that that is the most important part of themselves, you cannot exclude it from the political system and say you cannot be trusted to give to this organisation because it blinds you to logic. We do not make that claim, and we never make that as a necessary condition for any other belief anyone has. We're not sure why religion is different, because you can't prove it in the same way you can't prove other things. So, the state entitles religion to exist. In America, you are allowed to have whatever religious freedoms you choose. A fallout of that is that it allows people to have faith and to place religion and faith at the centre of their lives. They are entitled to define and spend their lives in the pursuit of that faith and living by the ideals that that faith prescribes to them. You cannot then simply deny them the way to be most effective at actualising policies based on their faith. You shouldn't be able to simply just leave them from this, cast it aside, because the church might be able to rally people to vote and might be able to make representatives listen to you. Harish.
So, I agree that we could talk about values of the democracy which matter, which is individuals that get expressed as success. Is that the only value in democracy?
No, that's why you get other sorts of campaigns, other sorts of particular interest groups that represent those other interests within the society. Those people are entitled to have money, those people are entitled to lobby particular campaigns and to lobby politicians. We're not quite sure this one isn't. We don't think it should be. Because some people believe that their lives should be dictated by their religion, because that religious part of yourself can be chosen to be left behind. But for the individuals that it isn't, they shouldn't have to feel they are weaker and excluded from discourse because they weren't to be trusted because of their religion. So some issues, then, are inherently religious. You can't simply suggest that we can have an abortion debate but not allow any church to contribute to that. If they want the outcome of that to simply be that more left policies or anti-church policies are enacted, while that might be something they're entitled to believe, it's not legitimate to limit the people who are most effective at campaigning for particular issues that are the beliefs of a large number of people within that society. We don't think that's good enough. They have made quite problematic concession, because they've just talked about Christians being able to outweigh everyone else, posh people happening to align to religious people. Smaller minorities have no opportunity to collect the funding or collect the capital to make their representatives listen to them when they aren't aligned with groups, especially those who feel targeted because of their religion. Those who have a valid complaint that they think America is moving too far away from having any religion allowed, away from having religious freedom be an entitlement. So the difference is that these people lose out. These people cannot have the strength of the lobbying power that can be bought when your church can support you. So when you're left as just a minority that you can't make listen to because you haven't the numbers, this is a way, just like other interest groups like trade unions, are a way of making people get that voice in the system. When you can choose, for example, at the lobbying stage and at the candidacy process, which is it you give your donations to, which group will listen to you more and embody your principles, you should be entitled to do that, not just if you're a capitalist or a socialist, but if the thing you value most about yourselves is your religion. You could vote on that. You can't just have that one chance, though. You have to be able to influence it from the beginning. You have to be able to make your representatives listen to you, and you have to have the state admit to you that it is valid for you to vote religiously, and it is valid for you to live your lives religiously, so we oppose.
It is simply naive to pretend that this is a debate about whether people can ever take in religious considerations into account. That is not what this debate is. This is a debate about specific, very powerful institutions using means like endorsing specific candidates and donating massive amounts of money to particular parties and candidates in a way that skews politics and skews decision-making for those individuals. This is not a debate about whether religion is ever legitimate as a consideration for individuals. This is a debate about the way in which particular institutions and the particular ways in which they operate corrupt politics. There are three things I want to speak about in this speech. Firstly, again, why religions undermine democratic decision-making. Secondly, why religion corrupts politics in this, and we prevent that. And thirdly, why the status quo allows elites to be unaccountable in the way that they use religion. Firstly, some points of rebuttal which fall outside of that. The broad point that Christine wants to make is that this sends the message that religion is uniquely illegitimate because we are allowing other moral considerations to be taken into account. But what, as I've just said and what I've just alluded to, we are saying is that this is about the power of institutions. This is about the power of mega-churches and about the power of very wealthy Christian lobbies to completely skew the way that those decisions are made by individuals and political actors. So it's not going to be attended by that message, presumably also because we're, when we introduce the policy, not going to be using that message, but rather using the language and rhetoric of institutional power that needs to be broken down in this case. No. What they also say is that it's unrealistic and bizarre to say that churches, for example, can take stands on specific issues but not take stands on, say, the political candidate they endorse. It's not clear to us why that is so unrealistic, right? So a church can still take issues of theological significance, and of course, there will often and sometimes be overlap with specific political questions. But there is a very big difference between a church offering guidance on specific questions that come up and their interpretation within a religion and the secondary question, which is when you take all those considerations together, including your own personal circumstances and including your own personal interest, whether taken together, that means you must vote for this particular guy. That is a very different sort of decision, and that's what we are stopping on this side of the House. So to get into the substantive. Firstly, decision-making.
All rationales of democracy, all attempts to justify democracy, place value on the reasons that people have for making particular choices that they make. It is not enough for that choice to be trivially a choice, in the sense that they actually believe it and express that view in the ballot box. It must be a meaningful choice. And to the extent that that choice is meaningful, we think it is more meaningful and more valuable as it becomes more independent. We think that there is obviously a spectrum, ladies and gentlemen. It is sometimes the case that we acknowledge that all views are to some extent influenced, and very heavily influenced, by society, by peers, and all the rest of it. But what we say is that in the case of extremely powerful religious institutions, which say that you will be doing something against God and against your community if you don't vote for this guy, we think that particular pressure is on the egregious end of that scale, ladies and gentlemen. We think it falls at the end of that scale that is so undermining of personal independence in weighing all those competing considerations along with your own interests. That is the problem. So what do they say? They say, well, look, they can help you understand your position in relation to the faith on particular issues. But of course, they can still do that. It's not clear why you need the church in order to be able to tell you what you should do once you've weighed all your other views, which presumably you still already hold, okay? So if you're someone who thinks, I don't like abortion, I don't like this, I like that, and I don't like that, just make the decision. I don't know why you need your pastor to be the one telling you that when you weigh them all together, that means you must vote for Joe Bloggs. In fact, I think it's rather unlikely that it will always be the case that when you've weighed them all together, you will always be voting for the same person. I think that's ridiculous. What else do they say? No. So that idea that you just can't understand which candidate is best for your views without the help of the church is patently absurd. Secondly, why religion corrupts politics. What Tom tells you is that the influence of religious organisations on lobbies and political parties is overwhelmingly in America from particular Christian groups. It's not equally spread across all minorities. What that means is that not only do those groups gain more political sway, not only do they gain capture of institutions by having the numbers and having the money to always be in a position to influence policy, and therefore, by the way, potentially undermining the idea that church and state should be separate in America, which is the foundational basis of that constitution. But moreover, it says to other minorities, it sends the message that your views will always be subordinated in terms of your access to political rights and your access to changing what is true of that polity. Your views will always be subordinated to a much more powerful group which massively outnumbers you and has far more resources. So when they say, there are other groups as well, it's not just Christians, the first point to say is that they are massively outdone, those minority groups. But secondly, here's the really crucial thing. It means that when those minority groups do campaign, they are inevitably tied, the policies they're trying to push are inevitably tied to the fact that they are Muslim or the fact that they are Sikh. It's inevitably tied to the fact that they are minorities, and they are never viewed as policies which are of independent value. That is not the case with the overwhelming large donations of Christians, who are very often able to, because they are from more general and larger organisations which have bigger public sway in public life generally, they are not tied necessarily by the rest of society to the fact that they are a minority only looking out for themselves. Rather, they are just people doing what they think is right. That's a problem. The idea that this is the only way for other minorities to organise is wrong. Firstly, because I just don't see why that would be the case, right? They can just organise anyway and campaign on particular issues, especially as they're often like geographically and concentrated and all the rest of it. But moreover, these kinds of issues where religious issues dominate are often a zero-sum game. It is often the case that the reasons for a party taking a certain political stance must take into consideration all religious views. The problem is that the religious views of the minority are massively outweighed in every single case by those of the dominant Christian groups. Thirdly, why does this allow elites to be unaccountable? I've alluded to this already. The problem is that Christian groups are and not just Christian groups, but they are very often able to highlight and push particular policies, but remove the aspect of self-interest from the message that they send. They're able to do things which are in fact self-interested, but appeal to the idea of selflessness and doing something before God. And moreover, those groups are overwhelmingly dominated by the rich, which means that the poorest of the poor within those groups are told to sell their values towards those dominant leaders. I'm extremely proud to propose.
First comments, and then we cross back and definitely we are the opposition to close out the case for opening opposition.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, in continuing the case of the opposition, I want to look at two things. First of all, I'm going to talk about how religious groups and religious organizations are, in essence, political organizations in terms of how people interact with them and how they use them to play out into the rest of their lives. And then I want to take a look specifically at the US Constitution and how this policy undermines the way that religious organizations and people in general can attain the freedoms that are guaranteed to them in that Constitution. Before that, two brief points of rebuttal. Firstly, we've had this idea from both speakers on the government side that there is a moral compulsion within religious organizations that simply cannot be argued against. However, recognize that that compulsion that can't be argued against is, in essence, the same no matter what group is saying anything and no matter where their views are derived from. All it is an issue of how individual voters weigh what different politicians and groups say. Underlying everything is a claim you just have to accept in order for that original thing to have any weight. So in capitalism, that claim is that I have a right to whatever I create through my labor. In socialism, it is that all people have an individual dignity. Like, those aren't claims, no thanks, that rely on something which you can argue rationally and that everyone will come to the same conclusion, right? It's exactly the same for the kind of things that underlie what religious organizations say. So it does not skew the discourse in the way these guys want to pretend that it does. Then we hear, no thanks. Then we hear that you simply can't offer any guidance as a church on what candidate to choose because you cannot amalgamate the moral questions that are at play within communities, right? Recognize firstly that you can choose who is closer to what the position of that church is and who best represents it, right? That's pretty clear. But recognize also that in US politics in particular, it is very much about choosing a character, choosing how that person is going to act once they are in office, choosing what sort of moral information they have in their heads and what sort of moral character they have. This is a nation with very few, for instance, referendums and direct plebiscites by which people can make those sorts of decisions, so that you do have to amalgamate the moral questions in order to choose your candidate. So it's very relevant when religious organizations want to do that for the people within their community who might be wondering who best fits to guide them. Let's talk about how religious organizations, no thanks, are in essence political organizations. First of all, let's look at what a political organization is, right? A political organization, such as, for instance, a trade union, is one which espouses a certain set of values and a certain model for our society to be formed upon. Recognize there is nothing exclusive in that definition that a religion does not do. A religion provides a certain set of values by which people should live their lives and a model for society to be built around, right? That is, in essence, a political organization that has a political message for how we should live our lives. It just so happens that they also have this belief in God thing. However, it is not true that that belief in God thing makes them irrational actors in the political sphere. No, thank you. Because people simply do not blindly believe whatever it is that their churches tell them, as these guys want to have you believe. It is not true, however much people might think they are immoral, which is, for instance, the same way people might feel bad voting against whatever party their parents choose to vote for, right? It is the same level of that kind of interplay on their brains that people can very easily escape from, especially when you have a private ballot, which in essence that church doesn't know about, or your parents don't know about, and all those sorts of things, right? So our minds on the issues are informed by religion. So it is very clear that religion should be at play, and it should be a vehicle for individuals to get their views out. Moreover, it's very important also that people know where these views come from when they come into the political discourse. Because even under this proposition, no thank you, these views are still going to become part of the political discourse. However, under the status quo, it's very clear that these are religious views coming from a religious community. So you can look into everything that religious community also espouses. No, thank you. And whether these views actually fall within that, and whether support for that candidate actually falls within that, right? You lose any of that nuance when people are just saying these things blindly, as in without the context in which those opinions were formed, and you lose an ability to engage with them on those opinions as well. No, thank you. They tell us
that religion skews politics. However, all they've told us so far is that money skews politics. They tell us about big money organizations and big money churches, right? They tell us that Christians are really bad. They don't say that the Muslim groups are really bad. Their prop really should be that they want to limit the amount of money that people can spend on individual political campaigns, no matter what their basis is. No thanks. It's not clear under their proposition why a trade union with lots of money wouldn't have exactly the same kinds of problems that a religious organization has. No thanks, you had your chance. You talked about money. In fact, I'll take you in 1 moment. In fact, religious organizations at present are only using that amount of money which they have to use simply because they have to use it in order to compete with the capitalists, in order to compete with the trade unions that already exist. Go ahead.
Do you think it's a problem that the discussion around women's reproductive rights or the discussion around gay marriage is solely focused on its religious elements?
I don't believe that it is solely focused on its religious elements. It is, for some people, focused on its religious elements because that is what is informing their decision-making process. If you remove religious organizations from the political sphere, those people will still have their minds formed by those religious organizations. However, we now can't tell who those people are in terms of they won't be campaigning based on that. So you lose any sort of nuance in the political system there and any sort of ability to engage with them. Let's talk about the Constitution. The US Constitution is a document which guarantees individuals freedom. They tell us there's a separation of church and state which cannot exist while we have religious organizations acting. In fact, the church is only informing the state in this sense and not in fact becoming part of the state. It's informing people's views. What the freedom of the Constitution does is it allows me to take my values and apply them to the world around it. That's why, for instance, the Supreme Court recognizes the ability of things like super PACs for capitalists to take their views and impose them upon the world around them, right? So my freedom of association with a religious organization, if I choose to be religious, under this proposition is something which is less important because I no longer have the freedom to impact the society around me in the way that I choose to do, and which is entirely arbitrary when my religious organization is no different to a trade union which just so happens to be what somebody else happens to align with. There is no reason why my freedom of association here should be diminished when it doesn't devalue the freedom of that is already there in the Constitution, that is guaranteed in the Constitution, and in fact it enhances it. I move to oppose.
And the Speaker and all speakers in the opening half, and now ask the member of government to begin the case of BPP.
Mr. Speaker, opening opposition are right that individuals should be able to express their views whether they happen to be religious or whether they happen to be otherwise. The question for this debate is whether or not those religious views have the effect of crowding out and destroying the ability of other individuals to get the kinds of policy outcomes that they want. Democracy is not an absolute good, Mr. Speaker. It is something that has to be traded off against the ability of individuals to be able to express themselves. So this debate is not going to be a referendum on religion. It is going to be a question as to whether the activity of religious organizations is going to prevent other individuals from having equal access to the democratic process, which our extension says it does in 6 ways. First of all, 3 things on opening opposition. They tell us that religious influence is going to be limited and that's bad. Obviously, that is something that is a harm that has to be weighed. But we're happy to say that in a situation where it enables other people to be able to express their views more legitimately, or even to be able to contribute to discourse without having vicious super PAC ads which say that you are immoral and against God for doing so, we're happy to say that's a trade-off that we're willing to have on our side of the house. Secondly, Mark tells us, well, what about individuals' character? Shouldn't people be able to vote on the kind of character that they want?
First of all, no, we think they should be voting on the kinds of policies that they're going to enact once in government, because those are the things that are going to affect other people. But second of all, it relies on the idea that you will be able to get a good account of somebody's character through the democratic process, which you almost never do. Look at the fact that individuals like John F. Kennedy were able to craft ideas, that they were very, very moral and also not disabled people, and very active people, even though those were fundamentally lies. Thirdly, they say it's important to know where individuals' views come from. In the first place, we think it's important that individuals have to justify their views in a way that appeals to a large number of people. The problem for too long is that the Republican Party in the United States has been able to say simply that God supports the candidate, which means that the individual's policy platform doesn't get examined. The fact that George W. Bush in the 2004 election was able to appeal to the religious right on the issues of gay marriage and on the issues of abortion meant that we didn't get a discussion in those communities about things like the Iraq War or things like the Bush tax cuts, which were far more important in terms of the policy change that would have been enacted. Because the reality is that the Bush second term made no impact on those issues. So the reality is that focus on character acts to the detriment of focus on the issues, which is more important for democracy. No. So, firstly, why are religious organisations disproportionately influential in a different way to a trade union? In the first place, because they're able to overcome one of the most important problems for a democracy, which is that there is a collective action problem, right? That it is generally not in the individual's interest to go out and campaign for particular issues, even if they believe for those issues, because the kind of impact that one individual can make is very, very limited relative to the cost to them in terms of donation or in terms of their time. Religious organisations are uniquely able to overcome those problems because they have a captive audience every Sunday, but they're able to use the rhetoric of duty and the threat of eternal damnation, which is quite a strong disincentive to doing something, which means that they're able to skew the democratic process by creating, first of all, the belief that there is more support for an issue than exists, because there are larger rallies and more vocal critics for particular policies, but also larger amounts of lobbying and larger amounts of campaign, as we've seen for things like Proposition 8 in California and the campaign against gay marriage, where people's views have been changed on that issue. But secondly, and more perniciously, religious groups are able to co-opt parts of the electoral process that are important for small constituencies, but are generally not electorally determinative. Because note, Mr. Speaker, whenever national opinion polls are published on issues on gay rights or on reproductive rights, the United States finds itself as a relatively progressive country that believes in the intolerance of those minorities. However, those are very rarely electorally determinative for the vast majority of people, right? Because whilst they might believe that gay marriage should be legalised, they're much keener on having good schools, on having good policing, and having good fundamentals for the economy. The problem is that it becomes electorally determinative for religious voters, right? Because they are told they will go to hell if they vote for a party that supports abortion. In that circumstance, you skew the democratic process because most individuals' preferences are not weighed within that process. Because candidates now, in order to be able to attract those votes, have to appeal to religious minorities and know that they won't face any backlash from a liberal majority. That's bad in and of itself, but also because even if those are very, very small groups, the fact that somebody like Mitt Romney will face vicious super PAC attack ads, even if you do have limitations on campaign finance, means that relatively libertarian parts of the Republican Party get co-opted to opposing gay marriage, even where they would support it. But thirdly on this, it means that they have impact in things like Supreme Court nominees, which have long-standing impacts in terms of the policy process for generations to come, and affect the constitution that Mark wants to talk about. Thirdly, in terms of how this affects people, this prevents choice for religious voters, because what we've seen following long-standing support for the Republican Party is that now American politics has become polarised, with the Democrats as the party of secularism and the Republican Party as the party of religion. That's extremely problematic because it means that the kinds of candidates you get might not necessarily reflect the policy issues that religious voters want, right? It is not fair, it's simply false to claim that Ron Paul, Mitt Romney and Rick Santorum, I'll take a point of information if someone wants to offer one.
All of the elements that you've been talking about just mean that religious organisations are effective political parties. Why should they still be likely to be effective when that's what matters?
because they hurt the preference expression of other individuals, because it means that the democratic process doesn't produce what the majority wants, it instead produces what a small minority wants. That's for all the reasons that I've already given you. But it means, as I was talking about, it means that now things like the market and things like free market capitalism have become linked to the religious right, even though they are not necessarily religious issues, simply because those parties happen to have conflated them over the course of time. In that circumstance, it means that we don't get individuals expressing their preferences over a policy outcome, they instead vote for a party because their religion told them so. But finally on this, it means that you get elite domination where particular religious leaders are able to dominate the political process by becoming the spokesperson for that religion and then by lobbying party leaders for doing so. The problem for that is that religious organisations, unlike trade unions, are uniquely undemocratic because the word of God is not terribly susceptible to democracy. In that circumstance, it means that you don't get the kind of change and you skew the democratic process even further. We would like to weight religious preferences, but we also care about other preferences. We're very happy to propose.
Let's give for response and then we cross and ask the member of opposition to open the case of Cambridge Day.
So, in the world of the proposition, the only thing religious leaders do is to tell the congregations, you must vote on one issue or you burn in hell. That is not how religious organizations work. They are not violently coercive in the blatant mischaracterized way that Prop tells us they are. I'm going to talk to you about two things in extension. Firstly, why religion is a perfectly legitimate moral framework. This will deal with all the stuff about crowding out that had to come under closing. Secondly, why is it that their policy uniquely harms religious discourse and makes it very difficult for us to engage with religious people on any meaningful level under their world. Firstly, therefore, why is religion a valid moral framework? The first thing I want to say is that the kind of problems of crowding out that Jack talked about seem to be problems that just afflict representative party democracies in general, right? Like in any kind of organization, individuals will be sidelined at the cost of certain people who are power brokers within the organizations. Why then do we still believe in representative democracy? Because we think organization has certain unique values. It allows you to state your values in a very influential way, to have a charter, for you to engage in democratic discourse and put yourself into the public space in a very prominent way. No. They believe this argument because they're only applying this argument to religious groups, not to any other parties which do all the same things. The question is therefore why religion is different from everything else. So let's look at why religion is different. One, because it's coercive. They said it lies at the egregious end of the spectrum. Look, if you are a libertarian, Obama's welfare reform is the worst thing to have happened since someone came up with the idea that there are rights for poor people, right? Like, people think of devastating consequences based on ideology all the time. Secondly, it's just false. I have never heard my pastor ever tell me to vote on something or I will burn in hell, presumably because Christianity is sensible enough to realize that people have a basket of moral views and that God will not put you in hell just because of one issue, right? Thirdly, even if people do believe that that's the case, that's their right. If I choose to believe that I will burn in hell unless I vote in this way, that's my choice. You should just respect it. We do not care for all your condescending nonsense. No thank you about what religious people think. No thank you. Furthermore, they tell us that religion is monolithic and coerces people to believing nothing but a few sets of things. That's absolute nonsense. You see huge amounts of religious discourse within organizations about one is right and one is wrong. Look at how, for instance, the debate between different churches, no thank you, like the Methodist or the more liberal wings of the Baptist churches, has become a debate about the proxification of the debate about what rights homosexuals ought to have. So the liberal wing of the Baptist church says the Bible tells us that love is always the highest value, and we ought to value that. While you see the more extreme Methodists say, no, marriage is a purely religious institution. So it's just a lie to say that within religious institutions, we can't get very meaningful debates that spill over in the same kind of debates that like liberals and conservative has over what the meaning of certain acts like marriage is. So that was also mischaracterization from them. Yeah.
You've just assumed that religious organizations come to their... You just assume that religious organizations come to their positions on completely moral grounds and aren't driven by the interests of their elites like every other organization. Please justify that assumption.
Okay, Okay, firstly, no, that harms your case as much as it does ours, right? Because you still stand for multi-party politics. Secondly, we tell you, we think it is right that people get to go to leaders and to ask them for moral guidance. Why? Because the moral world we live in is extremely complex. And it's not just us liberal people like to go read Nozick or Rawls or whatever to get religious guidance from a priori assumptions as to what is good or bad, right? Like, all Rawls does is put a liberal behind a veil of ignorance and say, yeah, that means that being a liberal is the right thing to do. So it's not at all clear that like a priori Rawls or like Nozick are more rational than religious people. But in the world of extreme moral complexity, it is good and right that I get to go to my pastor, a person I can trust on a much personal level than all these other philosophers, and ask him for moral guidance, ask him what the right thing is. No, thank you. They tell you that people will never learn to question this. That's nonsense, right? Presumably, if someone tells me, vote for this person because God says you so, I might ask, God is not an idiot. Why would God think so? And presumably they have to tell me reasons for why this aligns with my religious ideology. So it's not at all the case that religious people are just blindly stupid in the way you caricature them to be. Furthermore, like Jack tells us a couple of other things. He says that, look, all that they do is that they can overcome collective action problems. That would only be a bad thing if the way they overcame collective action problems was by refusing people any legitimate choice. We do not think that is the case, right? If they can overcome collective action problems because people particularly subscribe to moral frameworks, that's a good thing. There are some people who treat anarchy, state, and utopia as if it's their Bible. You don't say purely on the virtue of the fact that they believe lots in that moral framework, they should be excluded from overcoming collective action problems. The rest of the stuff Jack told us about why, like minority groups get sidelined. Firstly, on the comparative, it's better under our world, where those minority groups from different religions who might disagree can band together and form political organization. Because the comparative is this: the rich people under any group will always have huge amounts of power, and you don't change that. It is better, therefore, that minorities still get to band together and to collectivize their voice across broad socio-economic spectra and come to have a stand on those issues. So you harm these individual voters, these people will just be individual voters in your world, you harm them more than we do. Secondly, therefore, why is it that this harms discourse? Note that the US Constitution occupies like a quasi-religious place in the American psyche. People treat it as a central document of their identity and what the American state ought to be about. The moment we make that Constitution say, you know what, religious people, you just don't have a say anymore. You have no right, unlike liberals or Democrats or like people who believe in Iran or any other like philosophical group, to just assume a moral character as a group and to vote based on that. So you alienate them in a huge way, and that's incredibly harmful. Because if we look at the bits of the Methodist Church, or even at extreme groups like Westboro Baptist Church, we've moved away, thank you, from any kind of legitimate democratic discourse. The rhetoric that surrounds these is always that the state has abandoned us, that the state is fighting against us. And they refuse to take part in any of the rational, or what they call rational discourse that happens in the mainstream, right? No, this plays into what is already happening currently, right? Where they always say there is the mainstream media and there's a huge liberal bias against us. Precisely because of things like what Tom said, which is like, we think we liberals are just right. If you do want to engage these people on the legitimate level, there must be some point of contact between these different ideologies. You need to be able to respect them as people and to have them respect you as individuals and your moral views as well. Or you just wall yourself off, and that's when extremist views like the kind that they presumably want to guard against fester and are still expressed via the vote anyway, right? If people can still express their anger at liberals via the vote, the main effect of this is going to be make people shift more towards the right, more towards the kind of oppressive policies or so-called oppressive policies against homosexuals or against women that they're going to have. Because they now feel the only avenue left for them to engage in discourse is via the brute mechanism of the vote, and forcing people to listen to you because you have no other avenue of organizing and making people respect you as a human being and engage with moral views. For all these reasons, we are very, very proud to oppose.
Ashish is correct when he points out that religious groups are power brokers, like many other institutions which will presumably still exist within a democracy. The question, though, is, are religious institutions and religious individuals good power brokers? Are they reasonably representative power brokers of the general population? In Jack's speech, he was very clear as to many reasons why they were not. Very few were engaged with by Ashish, and we'll talk about three things in my speech. First, briefly the principle and why we think it is legitimate to limit free speech and limit free expression in a democracy. Secondly, the disproportionate power that religious institutions have in comparison to other institutions. And thirdly, the social implications and why this harms policy overall. Firstly, there are a couple points to respond to what we hear from Ashish. First, in terms of being legitimate, creating a legitimate framework, in the first place, as religious power brokers, they are incredibly dominant because they can decide the two candidates which you vote between. Note, in the United States, with a two-party system, it's particularly important who gets to decide those candidates. When religious minorities and religious groups, because of huge amounts of power, of lobbying influence, as Jack tells you about, and huge amounts of power in the primary process, are able to decide those candidates, they're incredibly coercive on the rest of the population in a way which is worse than other groups. I'll talk more about that one in a moment. Secondly, he says, the vast majority of pastors don't tell you you're going to burn in hell. I'm not sure if the vast majority do or don't, but I do think some of the most influential individuals do. Pat Robertson has an audience of millions on television. He's more than happy to tell you when it comes to reproductive health, if you allow abortion, you will burn in hell. Glenn Beck is more than happy to make those exact same statements. It's simply untrue to say that vast majority of people don't tell you you'll burn in hell. But even if you don't believe that, it can still be entirely coercive when you say it's a religious duty to support it. It might not mean the most extreme case, it can still be coercive and strongly influence individuals' views. Third, he said you won't have internal discourse within a religion itself, and that's harmed as a result of this policy. The first thing I want to point out is you often don't get discussion in religious institutions at all. Now, I am willing to accept, to some degree, both opposition teams are correct, that you might get some. But the important issue is both, as opening up government tell you, that you still have an elite-dominated process. But more importantly, the word of God, as Jack tells you, isn't something which is particularly easy for the vast majority of individuals in a congregation to discuss. They simply trust their pastor because he's the one with the most amount of information. It's why you have very slow evolution, if evolution at all, when it comes to religious views. But more importantly, that discussion is much harder when the stakes are raised. When instead the internal debate within the church is almost a strategic one, how best can we get our political viewpoint across? You crowd out the ability of the kinds of discussions they want. The debate about what the right view is becomes subordinate to the debate about how to go forward overall. Thirdly, he says, well, other kinds of views are equally coercive, exactly as opening opposition says, maybe the Nazikian. I'm more than happy to say that we might, under some circumstances, believe someone with as strong Nazikian views shouldn't be one of the most important people in a political process. That is a perfectly reasonable opinion which you can host, which can impact your views, exactly as opening government says, but probably shouldn't be the one which you put forward to every other member in society. But here's the important thing, right? The important issue here is that even if that dominates your own views, it's important, as Jack tells you, that you instead justify that view in a secular and rational way, which is something which you would do, and the vast majority of libertarians do attempt to do, but many religious individuals simply go back to the word of God of law. Then he says minority groups, it's good that minority groups are able to bind together. Sure, it is good that minority groups are able to bind together. This is as just a matter of fact, that's a far smaller proportion as the groups we're talking about in the first place, and they're almost generally always harmed as a result of this policy. But second, we don't think that they can necessarily bind together religious issues. Look, for instance, maybe the civil rights movement, the best case they're talking about. That creates schisms because you have different views and different religions. Treating this a religious movement ultimately meant that you had alienation of large groups who would otherwise be a part of it, like, for instance, Muslims. Finally, he says there'll be some individuals who will be alienated as a result of this policy. I'm sure there will be. That is necessarily a cost of doing business in this case. We're more than happy to absorb that cost. But what I'm going to say is the majority of individuals will ultimately be engaged in the political process more. They might be alienated in one way, but they'll still often end up going to the polls because they still care in exactly the way opening opposition tells you they're going to care. And in those circumstances, going to engage with more and more of the political arguments being made, and we think at least to some degree that offsets the harms they want to talk about. So first, on the principle, we do believe it is useful for religious people to be able to express their views, but they can never be the only value in a democracy. Why? Because expression of your view might well harm someone else, and in those circumstances, you need to make a trade-off. I'm happy to absorb most of the costs which opening opposition want to talk about, given the huge benefits, given the huge problems caused by those expression of those circumstances. What are they? In the first place, because religious organizations have unique power. Jack gives you a lot of analysis of how they are uniquely in the position to overcome collective action problems. Why is this an issue? Because that means that they can finance particular groups, they can campaign for particular groups, and have put disproportionate power, particularly when it comes to the Republican Party overall. Why is that a problem? Because it means that they can skew policy against what the general will would be. We think it would generally be beneficial if you ended up with policy which is beneficial to the vast majority of people in the United States. Doesn't happen. Why? Because for the vast majority, because firstly, you have a pre-selection of candidates and Supreme Court justices which limit the choices of large groups of people. But more importantly, even if, for instance, views like abortion are ever discussed in the political process, they're harmed. For the very simple fact they're often just never discussed in a way which is irreligious. Go ahead.
If candidates selected at the initial process are so representative who vote with the few you talk about, why don't independent candidates get elected?
Okay. For a couple of reasons. In the first place, they can still be unrepresentative on certain issues, but not unrepresentative overall. This is what Jack brings to you, and that I never engages with. For many people, the fact you take a position on gay marriage isn't electorally determinative, right? So they don't vote on it. They might vote on your economic interest instead. As a result, you skew that part of your policy platform in a way which is incredibly harmful or against the views of the majority of the population and only beneficial to the small minority of the population. That's why this often becomes hugely anti-democratic. But further to this, and this is on the second issue, it's incredibly harmful to society overall. Why? Because you play this own kind of identity politics. The Republican Party is now identified as the party of God. This is harmful for religious people in the first place because often it isn't even doing what we would consider God's will to be. Often members of the Republican Party, given such a diverse house, might well be doing something which is incredibly harmful to the interests of individuals overall, but effectively because they are Republicans, you've already created that belief that you should vote in a particular way. More importantly, to the co-option of particular views, a conflation, as Jack tells you, between other individuals who believe the market is right, the market is religious, and the religious people often never vote in their own interest because they're effectively already co-opted into this kind of identity politics. Finally, we're more than happy to say religions even aren't necessarily in the interest of the majority. They're elite-controlled organizations, and they don't have the democratic checks that even trade unions do. In the end of this debate, this is particular power and dangerous power I'm very happy to propose.
Closing opposition, the opposition bench, this debate, and the European University Debate Championship starting to roll as a whole.
Apart, perhaps, from the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States is the most sacred document to most Americans. That fact is why we are going to win this debate in closing opposition, because we best understand what modifying this sacred document is going to do to political discourse, to politics in the United States. I'm going to talk to you about religion in the real world and the United States Constitution. First, I want to highlight a number of things that this debate is not about, because it is not a debate about the influence of money in politics. They need to just reflect on the question of where those rich white Christians are going to take their money after they ban religion and then realize their policy doesn't solve that problem. Secondly, it is not a debate about party politics qua party politics. It is a debate about what closing opposition says about what this does to this landscape of religious politics and party politics, which is why I will refer to this later. Note that it can't be a debate about anyone ever using the word God, which is why it's unfair of Harish to say Glenn Beck uses religious rhetoric in his discussion. The model that we've been given is about religious organizations, and therefore saying, oh, but we would ban anyone who uses the word God while making a speech doesn't seem to be what opening government said they were talking about. So their core contention is to say that religious groups have huge power, which as far as we can tell means people agree with them. They also say that they distort discourse by making certain things into voting issues, which as far as we can see is to say Jack doesn't think those things ought to be voting issues. He thinks people ought to vote on the economy. He doesn't think people ought to vote on things like abortion. We think that there is no a priori reason to suppose that to be true. Crucially, we believe that the nature of democracy is such that you ought to create a system in which debates like this can occur, and that making a policy which stacks the system against certain points of view, like believing that socially conservative views based on religious ethics are illegitimate, is fundamentally immoral in the sense that it skews that system against certain views that certain people hold dear. Crucially, what happens is that they say certain types of discourse is not allowed. They beg the question of this debate by saying, as Harish does, that it is important that people justify their views in secular and rational ways. I'll take opening.
Your side consistently wants to claim that religious views are the same as all others. The difference is that followers of John Rawls don't grow up in immensely powerful churches dominated by an elite that determines who the correct Rawlsian candidate is.
Right, but followers of Ayn Rand, like Alan Greenspan, do end up running the economy. So I just don't think that your claim that only religious people have deeply held views and make judgments on deeply held views is true. I think that opening was perfectly correct when they said that most people's baseline moral values in the real world come down to intuitions that they hold which they do not investigate. That is what is crucially problematic for your side. Let's talk about religion in the real world, because they have committed the standard debating fallacy of assuming that all religious people are fundamentalist extremists. We just don't think this is true. We don't think for the vast majority of people who are religious, they believe that their priests have a hotline to God. Religion in their lives is the existence, the experience of a community, of points around which social life coalesces, right? Religion to most people is a set of values told through religious metaphors and scriptures which guide action, but which also provide them with a sort of language in which to have difficult moral discussions and with a place in which to have those moral discussions. And those discussions are majority one-sided in the sense that lots of them do involve an awful lot of a priest speaking, but they also involve an awful lot of chat over tea, etc. And what they do is they just exclude these because they say that they aren't important, and they exclude them in a way which we believe crucially harms the democratic process. I'd like to point out to you that it crucially harms minorities such as black people in the South, who have one of the lowest turnouts in elections across the United States, and for whom the church is a crucial part of the Get Out the Vote campaign. By shutting out Southern Baptist churches, you exclude certain people from voting because they self-select to not participate in that until they're inspired by this kind of religious rhetoric. We say to you that the marginal harm to those people is so much greater than the harm of removing those rich white people because, as I've said, they can deploy their resources in other ways. So yes, it is important to recognize that mega churches exist. Yes, there's big money in religion, but there are also giant lobby groups like the NRA and IPAC. And we say that without the assumption that churches are uniquely coercive, which I don't think that they have justified that they are, they need to tell us why this is somehow different from the NRA telling you that you are betraying American values, why this is somehow different from IPAC telling you that you are betraying the Jewish nation when they lobby, when they exercise exactly the kind of money and power that they are worried about. When they talk to us about religion and politics, they say a number of things. Opening government claims that religion is bad at assessing complex bundles of issues, like assessing candidates, etc. We're not clear why that is anything else than an assertion. But crucially, note that at least some political issues are single issues. So they need to tell us why in the case of Prop 8 it's illegitimate to hear the rule of the church when they are in fact assessing a single moral issue which has political ramifications. We think that this is a perfect example which crystallizes the harm of their policy because it just shows you that they don't want to hear one type of voice, not because of what its abilities are, but because of what it has to say. Okay, I'd now like to talk to you about the United States Constitution. First I'll hear Jack.
Yeah, our exception was not lots of people agree with religion. It was the fact that because religious are able to overcome collective action problems and able to skew policy on non-electorally determinative issues, you actually get policy that people do not want, and that's why skews democracy.
I think that this ability to say that people don't want it means that he is saying the views that people have when they sign a poll are somehow epistemically prior, somehow just more important than the views that they have when they go to the ballot box. Given that electoral cycles always involve buildings of enthusiasm around certain issues, around certain candidates, I don't think they give you any reason to believe that. Other than the rest of the stuff that he says, it just recurses back to saying he doesn't think that certain issues ought to be important. So let's talk about the US Constitution to end. Because it's crucial to recognize that the Constitution has value and is held in reverence across the political spectrum, right? It has huge political cachet to say that someone is attacking the Constitution or undermining your rights. So, when they make a one-time major liberal revision to the Constitution to say that religious people are no longer allowed to form religions at voting time, are no longer allowed to be important, what takes place? Note that this takes place in a context of conservative discourse about the liberal media and the New York liberal elite. It takes place in an era of the rise of the religious right as a voting bloc because Republicans believe that they ought to go from the out in when doing their lobbying. What happens after this policy is that that discourse goes off like a bomb, because now the Constitution is under attack. Now ordinary people who are religious see themselves as having something in common with nutcase religious people. Ordinary Americans who believe in the Constitution think that this Constitution is under attack. So that distortion gets massively worse on their side. So this is not only a policy which is terrible for democracy, it's also terrible for precisely the kinds of things that Jack worries so much about, and so we oppose.